Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Talking Landscape Photography for tonight. It's awesome to have you with us. It's lovely to be back and have a bit of a fresh break, a new start, and get stuck into a really interesting and exciting topic for tonight: long exposure photography. I've got some of my most dear friends with me here tonight, Nick, Paul, and we're also really excited to have Ben Mays joining us for the first time actually on the panel. Welcome, Ben, and how have you been going?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Yeah, really honored to be a part of the panel. Obviously, I know all you guys having shot in person, so it's great to be here with friends, and very much looking forward to talking all things landscape photography in the future.
Awesome. Yeah.
Just to quantify that, the panel is not just for tonight. He's actually joining our entire Talking Landscape Photography team as a long-term member for the foreseeable future. And Luke and I have discussed that, and Nick a bit as well, for a long time, about getting some fresh energy in the show. And if you show in the show description, and Luke wrote it beautifully actually, that Ben was on a show that was sort of celebrating a younger generation of photographers coming up, and he really exemplifies the kind of qualities of that us old guys are still sort of looking up to, or sort of scratch our head going, Jesus, look at these younger guys, they're going for guns. And Ben is a very skilled in camera craft. He's involved in a lot of different genres of photography. He's engaged in a wider community of landscape photography for some time already, and he's got a hell of a lot he can bring to the team. So we're super excited to have him on.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Nick, you might have something to say too.
I do. I've always got something to say, but it's literally chucking out the old and bringing in the new, because I'm going to be taking a step back from the panel. So I won't be appearing regularly, and I'm probably the least regular member of the three of us anyway. But we've been doing the show for pretty much 3 years now, and I've decided just to take a bit of a step back and do some other things. It's been fantastic, and I will still come back for things, but just not as regularly. So it's great to have Ben along to sort of fill my shoes, and Ben's a very well-rounded photographer, as Paul's already alluded to, and he's only a young'un, and he's already producing some very fine work. So I think, Ben, you're going to have an awful lot to contribute to the show, and I really look forward to coming back for particular things. And as most of you would know, that I'm not the most well-travelled person in the world, and I don't have the greatest connections out there, but I do know my home territory pretty well, Tasmania, and so I think when I do come back, it'll probably be more related to Tasmanian subjects, and I'll look forward to that. But definitely looking forward to tonight's show, which is going to be a very nice one, and it's one I'm surprised we haven't really. Well, I mean, I'm sure we've covered bits of it, but we haven't really covered it as a subject before on the show.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a kind of an interesting one, just reflecting on it in terms of, is long exposure actually a genre, or is it a technique or a style, or I guess it's a creative expression. So it's kind of you hear people refer to themselves maybe as long exposure photographers, but I think it's just more that's their preference rather than any particular kind of. You can still apply that long exposure to all sorts of different styles, I suppose. So
I think it's all those things, Luke, and more. It's a problem-solving technique. It can solve photographic issues. It can even solve creativity issues on when you're presented with conditions that might be otherwise a bit boring with photography, and we can actually, use filters and use different apertures and whatnot to increase the length of our exposures and get different effects that we wouldn't otherwise normally get for, say, the middle of the day. And it'd be great to talk about those, but it's such a broad subject. I mean, it really is, very broad, and I guess we'll probably have to come up with some sort of definition for what is long exposure photography.
Yeah, well, I mean, that might be a good starting point. I'm aware also that we've kind of launched into the show, and normally we do have a bit of a recap of what we've been up to. Maybe we could just spend a little bit of time just giving an update if anyone's got anything to say there. I know, Paul, you've always got something to go with.
Yeah, I just come back from a 10-day workshop in the northwest of Tasmania, which was pretty damn special, actually. And it's rare that I've run a trip of that length locally as opposed to internationally. I've done bigger trips internationally, but it's giving yourself that amount of time and space to connect with place. I actually came out of that trip, even though I was leading it, feeling refreshed and rejuvenated and really solid, instead of kind of fried and burnt out from no sleep and just racing like a headless chook. So it was really surprising just how fantastic I felt since coming back. And I had a 2 days Stanley, 2 days Corinna, 3 days in the northwest of the Tscharke, 3 days in the deep southwest, out to the coast, and a quick breeze through some of the Cradle Mountain areas on the way home. I'm also going to go around to Lukey's place next week and get some advice on how to deal with polar regions, because Uncle Paulie has never been to one. I've been stopping around the snow a lot in my life and guiding multiple day trips out the snow, but I haven't been in those kind of temperatures. So I'm leading a trip to Svalbard in about 6 weeks, and I'm hoping to breeze through Iceland all the way, and which has always been a dream, and do some flying over there. And yeah, Lucky's just fresh off the boat, so to speak. 3 boat trips, in fact. So speaking to someone that of Lucky's kind of caliber, who's so on top of equipment and gear and managing things in those sort of environments, is going to be really helpful. So yeah, a lot going on. I shot 17,500 images in the last 2.5 weeks, and a bunch of them are commercial jobs. So I got a lot of editing to do. So my Easter's going to be not quite as adventurous as it pretty much always is. I just decided that last night. I was like,
good
no.
thing that camera you're shooting is mirrorless, Paul, because you might have busted it otherwise.
Oh man, that thing's amazing. It's a hell of a workhorse. I think Ben's got the same camera as me, I think. But
no, he hasn't.
I'm on the Nikon Z7 II for me.
Oh no, I'm wrong then. I thought you were a Canon boy for some reason.
No.
Through and through.
It's kind of cool that we've still got the Nikon, Sony, Canon thing going, actually. So
it's actually a prerequisite for getting Ben on.
Yeah, that's true.
The reason
that's part of the vetting process. Yeah.
Oh, very good.
And how have you been going, Ben? I know that you do a lot of real estate and weddings and all sorts of things outside of your landscape work too. And I saw some really beautiful shots up from the high country as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a busy start to the year. Had a few weddings so far. So for those who don't really know me, I do kind of real estate photography during the week, and weddings on the weekends is my kind of supplementary work, or probably more landscapes are probably more supplementary than those. But obviously landscapes are the much more passionate about than real estate property shots. But yeah, I managed to get away a few times this year so far. I was in WA for a holiday with mates at the start of the year, but just 2-3 weeks ago now, I went down to, I covered probably about 1,400 Ks worth of driving in 5 days. It was a bit ludicrous. Primary goal was to get to Kosciuszko, and there's this particular spot off the main range hike that I was really keen to get to. Luke Hazard who lives down that way, has been posting lots of beautiful shots from that area. So I kind of figured out how to get in there, and hiked up into there, and that was absolutely incredible. One of the best places in New South Wales that I've shot, I think. Just really rugged, steep mountains, and the wildflowers were still kind of a little bit past their peak, but yeah, wildflowers were out. I got really nice atmosphere and dappled light, and a beautiful golden sunset in my second evening. So really nice couple of nights up in the Alpine sort of high country of Kosciuszko. No photos from that kind of part of the trip yet, but there'll be some to come for sure. And then I met up with Daniel Tran actually at the end of the trip in Narooma, and
cool.
We shot the moonrise and Milky Way combining in one at Glasshouse Rocks. So, and that turned out really, really, really well, and was one of the first astro sessions that I've had in years. And yeah, the 2 a.m. finish was something I'm not used to. So, but it was nice to kind of dust off the astrophotography skills and get into that sort of style of shooting again. It was good fun.
It's nothing really beats being out under the stars like that, especially if you're getting some shots that you're really, really happy with. I've actually just come back from shooting a dark sky project with an artist that's come down from Sydney, and so that's been very interesting. And I think we were doing a lot of late nights, and sometimes it was better to get up at 3 a.m. and head out then. And it was not much sleep, but that's what it's all about, really, is getting out there. And sometimes you have to just catch up with those Zeds a bit later and get what you need to get, because it's just this you can't really get out there any other way. So
any trip with you, Luke, is a trip with no sleep. Because you plan the whole thing except for sleep.
Astro trips are definitely the worst, because you want to shoot sunset, then you want to Astro normally starts only an hour after sunset, depending on what you're after, and then it depends on what you're trying to do, of course, but normally you're only going to bed at midnight, but then if you want to get up for sunrise, it's back out again. So you're really running your body clock pretty low, and so it's really important to make sure you prioritize rest and things during the day. But if you have to move on to the next location, then you have to schedule in some crash and burn time afterwards, I think. So
I just remembered 2 actually really significant things I wouldn't mind quickly mentioning. I'm just putting together a big landscape exhibition in the Barossa Valley with Tim Raitt and David Dalenberg, based on our Altitude South project. And we've got a website, altitudesouth.com.au, all about it. And we're actually just discussing today in the last couple of weeks about maybe doing another flight at the end of the month, actually, to cover some of the areas and get Channel Country and flood. So we've been doing the curation, and we're going to be working with Dex, hopefully, to do a book as well. So that's going to be a really nice sort of on-the-ground landscape project that's been building up for quite some time. It's all aerial-based and pretty exciting. And then my Men with Heart project is looking like it's going to South Australia later this year, and we're looking at doing a collaboration with a feminist artist, actually. Men's work and a feminine artist coming together to have a conversation about what defines healthy masculinity in Australian culture. So quite a few exciting things on the horizon on my end.
You're getting married, Paul, then?
No.
It's like a marriage, isn't it?
Marriage, I don't know about that. I don't know if I'm allergic to that one yet. I haven't figured it out.
No, that's great, and it's good to hear that you guys are potentially, you can see that work up close and personal in a gallery there. So that'll be pretty exciting. So and it's my heartland's back in the Barossa, so I'll have to try and swing over there at the same time. It'll be pretty special.
Well, opening will be 16th of June. Artist talk will be the 17th of June, and we're going to do an aerial photography workshop on the 18th of June. But I'll pop all the details into a show email, I reckon.
That sounds good to me. Yes. All right, and any other updates before we launch into the topic?
I was just going to say, Paul mentioning Tim Raitt. I actually just remembered I got to meet Tim Raitt for the first time about a month or so ago, actually, and went canyoning with him. And that was an amazing experience as well, getting to shoot that with him. It was one out near Lithgow that he'd done before, a bit of a beginner's one, but getting into those deep kind of canyon walls and slipping and sliding in the wetsuit and all that was a good first experience as well. Tim's a great bloke, so best of luck.
I've got some real treasured memories, actually, from 10 years ago when they were heading down there with Tim and back in the day. So it was really exciting to hear that he got back down there, and don't know if he got into the same wetsuit or not, but I'm sure he had an absolutely amazing time, because I still dream about getting back down there myself. It's the slot canyons in the Blue Mountains are definitely it's a world-class location, without any doubt, down there. And even though that one's a beginner, it's actually just insane fun. And sometimes when it gets a bit harder to get around, it might be not as enjoyable as well sometimes, because you just, or most of the time, trying to struggle just to get into the locations rather than actually taking some photos. So that's, I think, a good thing about that particular one. So Well,
Ben just put out an image from that trip, and it's fantastic. So if you're on Instagram, and if you're watching this show, or I guess you are on Instagram, check out Ben's latest work. What's you're just Benjamin.mays, aren't you? Or,
yeah. I can show it tonight, actually, when we're going through a little bit of a showcase. For
it's good. It's a long exposure, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great shot. And again, if you don't know Ben, he's a real master of post processing. So slot canyons are obviously difficult for balancing exposure, and Ben's done that very well in that particular shot. And interestingly, I had someone show me a sort of a sandstone canyon here in southern Tasmania that is under the radar that I'm going to have a look at sometime in the near future. I don't know how hard it is to get to, but I know where it is, and so I'm going to have a little bit of an explore and see. It's not really a slot canyon, but it's definitely a sandstone gorge with a creek running through the middle of it. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Very nice. Well, that's it's always good to have little things, little projects on the back burner there.
The gentleman said it reminded him of the Blue Mountains. So
there you go. Well,
seeing as I don't go to the Blue Mountains because I just do Tassie. It'll be nice to get a bit of it here if I can find it.
There's some in the southwest that I've seen pictures of, as equally as spectacular. But
that one that Martin, remember that one Martin Hawes had?
Yes, with the chockstone. Yeah, that was really special. So
it's nothing like that, but it'll
plenty of little hidden gems around. Right. Well, long exposures. Gents, how long is a long exposure?
How long's a piece of string? We have talked about this a little bit, and we've changed and sort of refined it a little bit. But I think we're going to use a lot of examples through the show tonight to maybe broaden your understanding of what that might actually mean, and also lean into the kind of creative capacities that it can allow, and go through some of the sort of hurdles and tricks and tips it just opens up a whole nother universe. It really relates to movement in a different sort of way. It relates to time in a very different way. And it opens up a huge amount of creativity often that you may have not even expected. And to me, the applicability of it, I'm actually going to be showcasing a whole bunch of portraits that I've done of long exposures, which is not something a lot of people have probably thought of, for instance. So hopefully by the end of the show, you'll have a lot more depth of understanding and inspiration about all the different sort of styles and avenues and techniques that it can encompass, which is probably even broader than we're going to even cover, because we're still scratching our heads about what defines it. We kind of use this medium, like where does it start? And we kind of actually came up with 1/4 second time-wise in terms of shutter speed, partly because that's often a shutter speed we use for doing like close-up seascape wave shots, and whether or not that requires a tripod or not is another question in terms of long exposures. And there's some great photographers that I'm actually going to talk about tonight that don't use the obvious techniques, but still work in that realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess with the way that image stabilization is going these days too, that you can handhold with my latest turning up to a second quite comfortably. And depending on the conditions, it's a few disclaimers, but it's definitely getting to the stage where, if you wanted to say a long exposure requires a tripod or not, well, maybe that isn't the case, but I guess it's at least a good starting point to consider. But that, I think, like I mentioned, then it depends on also what the actual subject's and doing, and if that's moving, and so you're going to get motion in that regard. So. Yeah.
Just in terms of the structure of tonight, so people know what to look forward to, is all four of us have, I believe, prepared sort of some images to showcase certain examples of things. And we've also put a little bit of thought into who we feel are some of the premier or more interesting photographers working more specifically in that realm and that genre. And we'll weave the conversation sort of in and around each other's images as well as the inspiration of people outside of our sphere.
Yep. And we're talking about 1/4 second is the starting point. So what's the end point for long exposure? Well, how long is a piece of string? If you've never seen a pinhole camera long exposure, I reckon put it into Google now, pinhole long exposure, and you'll see some year-long exposures that have occurred on photographic paper, and they're quite extraordinary. So we're talking a very long sort of period of time, and yeah, the conversation about a tripod or not a tripod's an interesting one, because there are some photographers out there, and we've had Will Patino on the show who enjoys doing sort of what would traditionally be the realm of tripod work without a tripod. You have special effects that you can use without a tripod, for example, panning for if you're capturing a motorsport, for example, which is technically a longer exposure where you pan the camera, so you're not on a tripod, although you might be on a monopod with those sort of shots, I guess. But yeah, and in-camera movement, and that's another example of panning, but where you have a type of effect where you blur the subject deliberately through the exposure. And I don't know if any of us have got examples of that tonight to show.
Yep, yeah, I've got a few different examples. I guess just when you're speaking about long exposures, I thought how long is a long exposure? I thought, well, I might just look up and see what my longest exposure I've ever done is, and it actually was only last year. And believe me, this is a very unedited image, so please go easy on any of the technical things going on here. But this is a shot that I took in the Western Arthur range, and it's actually a 30-minute exposure at ISO 200. And the main reason I did that was that this was literally pitch black when I took the shot. So you could not see anything in the foreground at all. So to be able to put it on there, I don't think I can go in too far on this, but it actually holds up pretty well because of the low ISO value. But yeah, and you can see a little tent down here just lit up on the edge here, and obviously you have a bit of a star trail going. But the reality of it is that I took this mainly to get a clean foreground so that I can and then to blend in a static Milky Way shot. So speaking of long exposures, a really good technique at night is to do a longer exposure for the foreground to get all of the detail there, because you can shoot it at a lower ISO, and then work on the sky and getting that to how you want it to be. Got a little bit of purple color coming through here on the edges, which has probably happened from the vignette correction, which I need to look at, but that's not it's not what you're going to put up online. But I just thought I'd quickly show that. And gents, do you have any other have you had a chance to see what your longest exposure might have been?
Probably similar. And I do like your commitment there with the 30-minute exposure, but you weren't committed enough to climb back down and pack up your tent like Peter Dombrovskis did.
Actually, that's not my tent, but
you didn't ask them to turn the light off and just wait while you hike back up?
I had to check, but it actually looks like a really unusual place to set it up. It's not a standard campsite there, so I don't know how they what they were doing there. But anyway, yeah, I do remember actually just lying down having a snooze next to the tripod there, taking it all in. Well, I wasn't taking it in while I was sleeping, but it was a pretty cool spot to hang out. So yes, that's the things we do for photos, as I say. All right. So I reckon might be worth just us starting to talk through some of the shots that we have as long exposures, because I sort of feel like a lot of the conversation just naturally comes up from discussing that, just like I was pointing out, using a long exposure for a cleaner foreground in a night image.
Just before we do we want to talk about the news we have with our giveaway sort of
content? Yeah, that's a really good point. I reached out to NiSi and Sirui, and they are going to provide as a prize a $250 gift voucher for each brand for a photography competition. And so we're going to be providing some details after the show, specifically what we're after in terms of entries for a competition that we're planning to judge in about a month's time. So in the not next episode, but the episode after. And the idea, of course, is to submit some long exposure photos that we'll also then critique and look at and I guess find some prize winners from in terms of the image that we like the best or fits the brief the best, I suppose, in terms of long exposure photography. Does anyone have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, well, I was thinking like some of the people who might be watching may not have done it before. They may not even own a set of filters yet. And so there's actually, I believe, Lukey, they're having a big sale that's starting right now.
That's right. Yeah.
So if you get moved or inspired from what we show on the show, it might, and along with a big sale going on, it's probably a pretty good opportune time to have a good crack at it. And I'd argue that it's definitely a great investment to start exploring all sorts of different kinds of ways of relating to images and time, particularly landscape photography. So if you haven't already, it might be quite an opportune time to do it. And also you might have a bit of fun applying it after the show if you haven't done much already and having a crack at the prize.
Oh, absolutely. And so NiSi is a filter brand, and so those filters we'll talk in probably great length about, because it's if you're doing long exposures during the day, it's quite hard to do it without filters. And Sirui is a tripod brand, and obviously tripods are also very important if you're doing long exposures, unless you're maybe like Will Patino or something like that and handhold everything. But generally speaking, if you're doing a 30-minute exposure or things like that, you definitely need to have a nice sturdy tripod to make sure that there's no movement over that time. And so NiSi's having 15% off and Sirui 20% off as of today, actually.
Easter sale, is it?
Yes, it's an Easter sale. So thanks so much to those guys for supporting the show, and I guess supporting you guys to provide that beautiful prize. So
we probably all use
go a long way. Hey,
we probably all use some of their gear, I reckon. Certainly use some NiSi filters.
I'm all NiSi, and all my tripods are Sirui as well. So I should probably knock on their door and say, "Hey guys, how about me? I've just been using this stuff anyway because it's really good sort of accessibility, value for money. They're very available on the Australian market, and they fit the bill really well for the functionality of what I'm after."
Well, we wouldn't use them if they weren't good. So I think that's probably testament. People know what our work's like, and we've chosen to use those sort of brands, and there's a reason for it. So they're definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely. And Ben, I think you use those brands as well.
Yep, I've been Sirui W2204 for me, and I'm not that much of an ND guy. I do have a couple of ND3s or so, but I'm using a circular polarizer a fair bit, which I've got with NiSi as well. So I'm a NiSi guy and a Sirui guy as well.
Yeah, nice. Well, anyway, there's we might as well launch in. Is anyone going to put up their hand to show some shots?
Yeah, you go, Nick.
I'll go first. I'll try and share the screen. So I think we're going to make it, see if it works specifically. Can we see that all right? Yep, you got that up? All beans. So obviously we're going to talk about different ways of creating long exposures, and I want to, with my shots, just sort of give a reason why I use a certain exposure time, because one of the main things with long exposures is it's best to have a reason for doing it, because when you're shooting, say, a seascape and it's sunrise, for example, the natural range of what you can shoot the waves at, depending on how bright the sun is coming up, you could range from 30 seconds through to a really fast shutter speed, 1/100th of a second or something like that, depending on the choices that you make, and they're creative choices. And so when you're choosing whether you use, say, 5 seconds for an exposure or 1/4 of a second for exposure, why are you making that decision? What are the reasons for doing so? And I guess that's the main message for this show, really, is it's a creative choice to use a certain length of exposure. And so always ask the question of yourself when you're there, what's the reason I'm using this particular exposure? Is it because I have to because of the conditions? Is it because I'm trying to solve a problem? Is it because I creatively want to do it this way to show a certain movement through the scene? And so all the shots I've got are going to have a reason behind it. And so, yeah, I'll explain as I go. But this first shot here is taken at Cradle Mountain. And interestingly, this was actually not shot as a single exposure. And this is the one and only time I've ever done this. And there was quite a few of us here. It was taken during the Fagus, turning of the Fagus that we have here in Tasmania, which is a deciduous tree that turns at this time of year, or a bit, end of April, early May. And there was a group of us down here doing some sunrise work, and it was a beautiful, real eye bleeder of a sunrise. And another one of the photographers, Carl Strand, who's a fantastic photographer that many people will have heard of. And if you haven't, look him up. He mentioned that you can do long exposures by doing multiple exposures. And this was specifically on the Nikon cameras, and I've got a Nikon camera. And I hadn't heard of this technique. And to be frank, I can't remember what I have to do to get this done, but it's not difficult. But anyway, he showed me that this is an in-camera technique for getting a long exposure made up of a bunch of short exposures. And I'm sure the other guys have heard of this sort of thing. And you can probably do it on any camera brand, I would have thought, any modern camera brand. And it's basically stacking all the moving parts and evening them out to create a long exposure. And this particular image is an example of that. There's probably, 8 or 9 exposures in this that have been taken one after the other and then combined in the camera into one image. But it's not a particular one exposure, and it solves a problem where I don't know the best way to explain it, but if you have one long continuous exposure, there might be a problem that you introduce, and this way of doing it in camera of lots of little ones and then all being combined might solve that problem. So just get thinking outside the box. The others might mention it too, but unfortunately,
I'm just interested, Nick, does that output it as a raw file, does it then?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, and it's definitely, it's not a feature that Sony has. So it's not across at least all, maybe.
I think, yes, I think that's it. I'm pretty sure that's the case.
I think the first time I ever saw it being done was in 2019 on someone that was shooting a Sony, actually.
Okay.
That was maybe an A7R2 that they were shooting on.
I think you can definitely do multiple like a continuous exposure, but it won't actually output it as a raw file.
It might have been, I think, with Sony, because you can do that, add those little apps or something within the.
Oh yeah,
it might have been one of those. It
could have been it. That was like that sort of came out, stopped around when it was an A7R2, I believe. So it's. Yeah, a lot of functionality actually went when they changed the play memory stuff. But I think it's also a technique you can use median stacking within post. So you just align the layers in Photoshop and then apply a median stack. And
it's an in-camera median
really
stack.
Good noise reduction technique.
Yeah.
Actually, I had no idea Nikon's did that, Nick. I'm going to have to look that up on mine.
Yeah, Carl Strand showed me, and like I said, I haven't used it since, but and I'm just trying to think what the use case is for using it, but it does solve a problem that you might have with a continuous exposure. Actually, I know what it is. It's median stacking. So if you were at, say, you're at a well-known tourist destination, it's the middle of the day, and you've got lots of people walking around the scene, but you want a photo with no people in it, then by using this technique where it combines all the images, it'll keep everything that's still and anything that moves during those images that you take, it'll cancel out. And I think that's one of the use cases for it. So it's technically not a long exposure, but it's combined to become a long exposure.
That's interesting. And also, I guess, if you happen to forget your filters, it's a nice fallback as well.
Well, that was the other thing. And look, it might even for some people, it might even mean that they don't need filters. But having said that, I'd much prefer to get it done with one shot with a filter, just so I know I've got it all. But
there's
anyway,
all the arguments to only get it in one. Like there's just the romance of it to start with, and then also just having less files to play with, less shutter actuations on the shutter. So there's a lot of advantage to filters.
Yeah, and this shot's taken during the day. This was maybe a 30-second exposure or 20-second exposure taken at Cape Hoy on the well, it's now part of the Three Capes track, and Luke was actually nearby me. He was a bit further down when we were taking this. He was obviously shooting something less interesting than what I was shooting. But
that's a cracker.
What I've done here is it was a great scene because you got this cloud in the background and this sort of misty sea mist thing that was just hanging. But just shooting it with a normal length exposure during the day was creating some textures on the water that were just a bit, it just looked a bit ordinary. And so to solve that textural issue, I put on a 10-stop filter, so a very dark piece of glass that goes over the top of your lens and reduces the amount of light coming in. It's like putting a pair of sunglasses over your lens to stop the amount of light, but this is a really, really dark one.
Do you use the square ones, Nick, or do you use the so this is what they would look like just putting in the front if you haven't seen one before. You can also get the screw-on ones that go over your lens, but
I don't think anyone will see that, Luke, because you're
really
sharing the screen. So
okay, fair enough. Well, I can show it later.
But we will do that. We'll show particular things. But so this was a creative choice to smooth out the water during the day, and really I think it was for the best with this particular shot. And you can see
it's just about simplifying the water, isn't it? So it's a bit smoother and and
look,
the textural contrast is great too, because you've got all that really high frequency detail in the cliff, and then it's completely smooth and flat in the ocean, so it draws your attention to the cliff.
Juxtaposed
texture.
Absolutely, and I said that's the creative decision I made to shoot it like that, and it just, in my opinion, made a better photo than not using a long exposure. So
one of the challenges with this sort of shot is that they're often very windy places too. So to try and get a long exposure when you're on a cliff top like that can be quite a challenge.
It can, and that might be, and look, that might be a decision that you then have to make. Oh, I can't get this shot because it's so windy. And I guess having a really sturdy tripod's a good start, but also you might need to sort of shift your position to get out of the wind a bit more. And I've done that before. I've had to shelter behind a rock to take particularly a longer lens, long exposure, where any little shakes will cause dramas.
Can you tap I just so we can see the shutter speed?
I don't know if it will
not overlay. Okay.
I don't know if it will tell me or not.
If you tap the I key, is that in develop? Should be in library. There you go.
It won't.
Tap it again.
I tap it again.
No, it's lost it because I exported it recently. I mean, I could look that up.
Oh, you're right. You just scroll down the metadata tab.
Yeah, these are not the originals. I've compressed them and done them for the show, particularly. Get rid of oops. Okay, so this is obviously a nighttime shot. It's an aurora taken here in southern Tasmania, and you need a longer exposure to take night shots. But I wanted to bring this one up because I actually needed a shorter exposure than normal to achieve the shot. So this was quite a spectacular aurora, as you can tell, and from the patterns here, if I'd opened the exposure for too long, I wouldn't have got the textures in these beams. They would have sort of moved because the aurora is a moving thing. And if you have too long an exposure with an aurora, say 30 seconds, then you can get the similar sort of effect that you get with water, that all the textures sort of meld together and become too
amorphous.
Yeah, they become blurry. Sometimes the aurora is not very bright and you have to have a longer exposure because you've got to compromise on depth of field and long exposure and all those things that you have to, make decisions on. But for this, it was critical, not only that I had a short exposure for the aurora, but I needed a short exposure for the boat. If I'd left it open for this, it was a really still night, but this is an estuary. It's a tidal estuary, so the water, it's always flowing. You've got water flowing down from the river, and you've got the tides influencing, and as a result, the boats move, and they move a lot more than you'd think just looking at it at the night time. So I chose a 4-second shutter, which meant that I had to choose a really open aperture. I think this was f2.2. I was taking it with a nifty 50 mil 1.8. And yeah, I had a 4-second exposure, and I think ISO about 4,000. And yeah, to try and get it as fast as I could without then compromising other things that would affect the image quality. Like, I didn't want too high an ISO because it would make it a bit noisy. And this was a good compromise. And it was a decision I've made from a technical point of view, whereas if I'd had it open too long, say 10 seconds, then I would have had movement in the boat. And if I'd opened it for 20 seconds, then I would have had not only movement in the boat, but some textural issues in the aurora itself.
And probably some star trailing too.
Yeah, and definitely with 50 mil, yes. And look, I'm not always as
pedantic
about that stuff, but I know you are, Luke, and yes, it's definitely a factor. And with a 50 mil lens as opposed to a wide angle, the longer you have the shutter open on the stars, the more likely you'll get those star.
Yeah, you've only got about 3 or 4 seconds at the most, I think, at that sort of focal length before you start getting any sort of, depending on how much you want to zoom in.
Yeah, I mean, obviously down the bottom you've got star trailing because it's a reflection, but in up the top, they're pretty pinpoint there.
There's a nice little green complement just above the boat there too, like centered that green to just sit above the boat. And would you ever go to shutter speed then when you're doing these shorter aurora, like 2 or 3 seconds or something? Or
look, I generally will go between say 4 and 8 seconds. And that's because I could go a lot shorter. I could up the ISO up to 25,000 or something, and go shorter. But I want a compromise that I'm happy with, because I don't do median stacking and stuff like that very often for nighttime shots, and I like to get it all in one shot. I've got to come up with a compromise where everything sort of works, and sometimes it doesn't work, and I have to walk away and say, right, well, tonight's not the night. If it had been windy on this night, then I wouldn't have been shooting boats on the river. There wouldn't have been a reflection, or it would have just been a haze, and the boats would have been moving. So I would have gone and shot something static, so like a building. And I wouldn't have shot a tree, because if I'd shot a tree and it's windy, then the leaves are moving, and I don't want that. So you make these decisions based on the conditions you have and the options you have for the exposure time, and sometimes nothing works and you walk away. But yeah, anyway, I'll move on to the next one. A bit of an eye bleeder here. And this was just taken on the east coast of Tasmania on a bright sunny day. I was just out having a walk, had my camera with me, having a bit of an explore, and it was just a beautiful day. And I decided to whack on a polarizer, which is a good way of cutting out reflections, and it's also a good way of slowing the shutter down a little bit, because it sort of adds about 2 stops to your exposure. But with this particular shot, which is about 2 seconds in shutter length, I would have not only had a polarizer, but I would have had a 3-stop or a 6-stop, maybe even neutral density filter on top of the polarizer. So I stacked the two together in order to achieve this effect. And this particular polarizer is one that NiSi have. It's called a landscape polarizer, or an enhanced landscape polarizer. So it really brings out the colors very boldly, and it's not for everyone's taste. And I think NiSi have a range of polarizers, but this is the one I got with my kit. And it does really bring out colors, particularly greens and blues, which is what you see here with this. But again, I didn't like, 1/500th of a shutter speed on this. I wanted to get a longer exposure just to give a bit of sort of blur in the water, but still have that bright sunny effect. And so that's a creative decision I've made. And it could really only be achieved in this circumstance with a circular polarizer, because it cut out those reflections. Yes, I probably could have done that median stacking method for the long exposure and not needed a neutral density filter, but I did use a neutral density filter for this, and that's the result that we got. But yeah, again, a creative decision, wanted to do something with it a bit more than just take a shot at the normal shutter speeds. This is a moonrise, Mount William National Park up in the northeast. And this was taken with no filters. This was taken with the shutter speed that I required for the depth of field that I wanted, for the ISO that I wanted for this shot. So it's about 5-second exposure, which has blurred the water. The water didn't have anything to really add to this, but this was the ambient light that was available. And so I used the shutter speed that the camera suggested for the aperture that I wanted and the ISO that I wanted. So this is just showing that it's just a long exposure without any filters stacked on the lens, just as it was. And I was happy with that shutter speed in this particular circumstance. Okay, so this is a bit different. This is taken up on Cananea Mount Wellington, and we had a light show that was being put on down in the Hobart Central Business District, I think, or close by. I might have been over at Rosny, and it was shooting these green laser beams everywhere, and it was synchronized to a music program. So you're listening to music in your ears, and the pulsing of the lights was synchronized with the music. And this was a really so I went up the mountain and decided to try and get some interesting shots with these beams that were away from the main show. And the problem that I had was that these beams were moving very quickly. And so what I had to do with this shot is really crank up my ISO and bring down my shutter speed. So this shutter speed for this photo is 1 second. It was a moonless night. So I think my ISO was about 16,000 for this shot, and you can see it's reasonably noisy, although it's not too bad. And I think I probably had an aperture of 1.8 for this shot, using my 50mm lens, and that allowed for a 1 second exposure where I was able to capture the light beams frozen. If I'd had it open for 3 or 4 seconds, then those light beams would have been blurred and lost. So it was a decision I had to make to solve the problem. The problem was that I wanted to freeze the action, and it's still a long exposure, but it's a much shorter long exposure than you would ordinarily have for that sort of shot, that sort of scene. And this was taken the same night, and this is a 3 second exposure, and you can see what I mean. So I'm facing away from Hobart, and these were heading off the distance, but you can see the blurring of those beams in 3 seconds. You can see that they've separated into different fans, and so any longer than 3 seconds, and I wouldn't have got any definition at all with this shot. But I'm pointing dead into night sky. So this is again taken 16,000 ISO in order to achieve the effect that I was after, and it was a really difficult shoot. Doing this was hard, and it required using your brain and trying to get yourself in positions that were interesting. And I really, really enjoyed it because it made me think on the spot and go, right, I'm observing this now. Where do I have to be? How do I have to set my exposure to get it to work for me? And there's nothing special about this image as such, but it's interesting. It's different, and yeah, that shutter speed choice allowed it to happen. And I think the last image, is this the last image? I think so. This is a shot taken at Mount Field National Park.
I thought it might have been, yeah. Ben likes that spot too.
Yeah, and it's a short, long exposure. So it's probably, I think, a quarter of a second. It was really windy. The ripples were moving really fast on the surface of the water, and I wanted to not freeze the ripples, but I didn't want the ripples to then take over the image. I wanted them to sort of refract what was going on underneath. So I found with experimentation, and we've got digital cameras, we're not wasting any money, you may as well experiment, that quarter of a second was the right shutter speed for this sort of effect. And, it's not the most spectacular image, but I enjoyed the effect.
I can honestly say that that's one of my favorite photos of yours. That might be weird, but I love that photo.
Oh, that's really good to say. And other people have really liked it. And I do, don't get me wrong, I do like it. And I'm showing it because I know people have said they like it. And so, yeah. But yeah, it was a creative decision. Is that you, Paul?
Yeah, that's me, mate. The Dutch sneeze. Look out.
Yeah.
Out of the windows.
Had a few of those over the years.
I got to throw a few surprises in the air for tonight. No, keep you on your toes, Nick.
That's the way, mate. But yeah, if this had been shorter of like a 1/60th of a second, a normal sort of shutter speed, then it wouldn't have looked like this. And then if I'd left it too long, it would have blurred it too much. So this was a creative decision I made, and it was just like experimentation to get the speed that looked best, in my opinion. And I think I know one more. And this one it's a nighttime shot, but I wanted to show it not because it's a nighttime shot. I wanted to show it because it's something you can do during the day. So the clouds in the background, you can see they've got this streaky effect. Now, I couldn't find the shot that I was after. I took a shot in the walls of Jerusalem some years ago where I noticed there were all these speckly clouds. So you get those they're just little puffs of cloud, and they were streaming overhead. And I put on a 10-stop neutral density filter and left the shutter open for a minute or 30 seconds or something like that during the day. And it created the same effect that you've got in this photo, where the clouds have been streaming sort of overhead and creating this sort of effect. So they're speckly clouds that are then drawn out as a long exposure and causes this streaky thing. And if you ever see that during the day, it's a great opportunity to get out the filter and get some really cool effects. And I think Carl Strand, I was talking about Carl earlier with the Cradle Mountain shot, he's got a fantastic shot like this that he took during the day over Kitchen Hut and Cradle Mountain, where it's that exact effect, I'm pretty sure, where he's got those streaming clouds, and it's a really beautiful shot. But anyway, I just chucked that in to sort of demonstrate what I meant. Even though it's taken at night, during the day you get the similar effect. So that's my images there. I'll stop sharing. And
Nick, do you want to, while you're sharing that, do you want to lean into the photographers whose other work you're drawn to, or?
Look, I might leave that for you fellas because I didn't think about it well enough. There's a couple of people I got in mind, but I think they'll be mentioned anyway. So I might let you guys.
Yeah, that's fine because
yeah.
Time-wise, with 4 on the panel, we probably need to keep whipping along anyway.
Yep.
Batter up. Who's next?
All right. Well, I'll take the bait. Or did you want to go, Ben?
Just going to say I've got some noise going on in my house, so I'll stay muted for now.
That's all good. No problem. We will. I'll share away now. And
dance party at Ben's.
Sorry.
Dance party.
Yeah. Party house. All right. So. I've got a bit of a selection here of different stuff.
I think I might have been standing next to you when he took that.
Possibly. I have shot up there a couple of times, but This is a 121 second image, so about 2 minutes. So for me, I shoot all sorts of exposures, and much like Nick, and I guess most experienced photographers, you try to choose a shutter speed that kind of suits the the scene and what you're trying to achieve with it. So you're always choosing a shutter speed for a particular reason, as a creative or technical effect. And so in this case, I really love simplifying the water. And so by doing a 2-minute exposure, we're able to really smooth out these clouds and the water, and it really calls out the headlands, and I guess also it becomes a bit more about some of the soft colors and that kind of thing. I guess if you can have some soft colors with some soft textures, it sort of complements it quite nicely, and that kind of thing. So that's sort of around your 2 minutes. This one here is around about was that about 10 minutes or a bit over 15 minutes, I think. Let me just bring it up. Yeah, and so one long exposure effect is obviously to do some star trails. And so by leaving the shutter open for a long time, you're going to start to see the Earth's rotation in the stars. And if you're lucky enough to have some aurora as well, you can sort of combine it all together in a frame. The technique Nick was talking about in terms of taking multiple exposures and then stacking them is probably a better option as well for star trails, but I think in this case I just wanted to try doing a single frame. The risk in the nighttime doing a single frame over long exposure is someone comes along with a head torch or a car pulls up, which is very possible to happen in this sort of location. You'll get the tree will be overexposed immediately, and the exposure will be ruined. So you are taking a risk doing a long exposure at night. My prior example, which was the 30-minute exposure, there's no chance of car headlights there, thankfully, because it was a 5-day hike to get out there and back, at least. So that was handy. I didn't have to worry about that so much, but you do still have to be very careful of anyone that you're traveling with, and whether or not they've are aware of what you're up to and what they're doing with their head torch. So it's fraught with danger, but it does turn out quite nicely when it does. This one here is it's one of my favorite long exposure locations, actually, in maybe anywhere. It's Trousers Point on Flinders Island, and in this case, we've got a 227 seconds, so it's almost a 4-minute exposure, which is around about my sort of favorite exposure length. If I can manage that, sometimes 3 minutes is fine too. And the idea with that sort of exposure length, as I indicated earlier, is just to smooth out all of the clouds, and then also really just get the water so it's a glassy finish. It takes off any of the like little bit of textural detail that you might be having there. The long exposure didn't really help the foreground all that much because it was relatively static as it was, but certainly helped with the stars and the sky and the water there as well. So I mean, you could argue that you could take that shot without it being a long exposure, but I just like the pleasant sort of nature that these longer exposures provide.
Just going to say, Luke, I really love the clean line between the kind of turquoise and darker blue with the seaweed and the water.
Yes.
Almost like a yin yang sort of shape to it.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really cool.
That's really nice little touch there, and long exposures really help to accentuate that and really make that a much starker line. There might be some examples coming up as well where there's a horizon line, and it tends to really accentuate horizon lines as well. So they almost look like they're razor sharp, which can be quite cool as well. This is another one. This is a really awesome location in Tasman Peninsula. And have the waterfall coming down with a bit of mist around, and then a long exposure there just to smooth out all of the water going around as well, and that just really helps kind of make it feel a really ethereal, sort of like it's a cloudscape but land, but not. You sort of just gives a very otherworldly kind of feeling when you can really smooth things out, and that's about a 3-minute exposure on that one there.
So like a 15 stop, Lukey?
It probably would have been. Typically, during the day, a a 10-stop filter gives you, if you're shooting around f11, generally it gives you about 30 seconds. So if you want to go anything longer than about 30 seconds, you're going to have like a 15-stop filter, or at least stack a couple filters on top of each other to make that happen. So this is something a little bit different. This is a cityscape, and I actually used to, when I was getting into landscape photography, I actually shot a lot of cityscapes. It was actually what I shot more than anything else, and landscape sort of came after. I did a stint living in Brisbane, and so this is the Brisbane River, and so I was able to get that river looking very glassy, and you can also see the clouds really streaking and moving behind. It gives a really dramatic effect as well. It probably would look quite good in black and white, this one as well, because of that. And my example photographer uses that technique very well. This is just to show how much I appreciate this location. It's just another Trousers Point image coming up, and that's a great location, as I mentioned, for this sort of thing. This is actually looking almost at the same location but the other way. So it's when it's, because it's so protected there, you're able to kind of take a whole bunch of shots that the wind's not really going to bother you, even if the oceans are, or it's moving around a little bit. You can still smooth that out quite nicely, and it creates a really pleasing effect. Another one here. This isn't quite as long. This is about 38 seconds, just coming up, and this one is the long exposure here has really helped create sort of flatten out a little bit of this textural detail in the water. That you get these really awesome like foam lines around Tasman Peninsula, and that's just really helped them. It's really helped to streak them out a little bit, and smooth those lines out so they're not quite as harsh, and create a little bit of softness to the scene. And it really makes the stark rocks stick out quite a lot more when that happens. I guess what before the show we're talking about ICM, and no, I'll do this one as the last sort of one before I launch into that. Just another example of trying to get a bit of reflections, and just a really nice pleasant scene, bit of mirroring of colors and vanishing points and things like that. And that's at 151 seconds, so just a bit under 3 minutes for that one there as well.
So that's probably one of my favorite, like long exposures of yours, Luke, as well. The colors, the simplicity of those mountains in the background is beautiful. It's really, really nice.
Oh, thanks, Ben. And that would be to achieve something like that. It's different because we're at a twilight scenario here, the light is getting lower, and if you were to use a 15-stop filter in this sort of scenario, you might find that your exposure time is going to blow out to like 10 minutes or longer, just off the top of my head. So you'd be more likely to reach for a 10-stop filter on twilight, or maybe even a 6-stop filter. Generally, I think I sort of feel 6 stops at twilight gives you 30 seconds kind of thing. So that's why I guess having a 6, 10, and 15 is very helpful for these sort of long exposures, because you can pick and choose the filter, the strength of the filter, or how much light the filter's letting through, based on what the ambient light level is. So I also sort of thought about ICM, and it's not something that I do. And then I realized that back in the day, I actually did do a little bit of ICM stuff, but maybe a little bit differently to what is or way it's traditionally done, I suppose. And this is actually a series of work that I did, and I've always been meaning to do it again, but I'm not really a city boy anymore. But it's actually doing a long exposure using a tilt shift lens, and so it's actually shifting a tilt shift lens during a long exposure to stretch the image out. And I guess traditionally, when you're doing an ICM, or intentional camera movement, or other derivatives of that acronym, you're moving the camera up and down. But what happens is if your camera has any barrel distortion or perspective shift, you're actually going to get a curved lines. So by using a tilt shift over a long exposure, you're actually getting very straight lines with this sort of effect, and it makes a massive difference. Actually, I've tried it with other lenses, and it really is one of those. It's a very strange use case for a tilt shift, but I don't know if there's. I guess you could get a wind up center column or something maybe, or do it with that. But those sort of things, this is where creativity comes into play, and I'm trying something new. And these images are actually picked up by Yellow Corner Gallery, which is a big sort of gallery in Europe, and it's being sold quite a lot of prints actually through them of these particular images, which is kind of ironic in a way. Probably make more money out of those than some of the other things.
Yeah, well.
And so the other factor is that I also have experimented with ICM at night as well, which is another technique. And this is a technique that I particularly enjoy doing. I lose hours and hours trying to perfect different looks, and I was doing some the other night as well. And so with this, you're obviously zooming a lens over a long exposure, and when you can apply that to the stars, you actually get a very you can get very dramatic effects if you do it the right way, and it's quite nuanced in terms of timings, and obviously you don't want the tripod to be moving very much because the stars then start to get a bit jiggly, and that's not always desirable. But if you're able to play around with it, you can often get some pretty amazing little effects going that just like everyone kind of looks at that and thinks it's like maybe a galaxy exploding or something like that, which is kind of funny. In fact, I first posted a shot like this, and I said I had a caption a bit like that, like I was walking down the street the other night and I looked up and it looked like I saw this, and I was like, I wondered what was going on, and people go, "Oh, check out what this guy saw." It's kind of weird. Anyway, and then just to finish off, one of my favorites more recently is back at Bruny Island. Just a nice long exposure. This one's probably not as long. What are we looking at with this one? This one's 30 seconds. Yeah, so just to smooth the water out. So I mean, you could probably get a reasonable shot without even a long exposure on this sort of scene, but it's definitely enough just to take away some of the textural detail that might distract you. I guess you want the eye to be looking down this boardwalk here rather than all around the other areas, and so by doing that, you're actually able to it's just keeping the viewpoint in the middle and moving down the stairs there. So that was a nice way of simplifying everything up as well. Yeah. So that's probably a few examples of what how I've used long exposures over my journey.
Very nice.
Cool.
Very good.
I was just thinking we've sort of made a few assumptions a little bit that people know what 3-stop, 6-stop, 10-stop, 15-stop is. So basically, they're the grade of glass and the density of how much they block the amount of light coming through. So a 10-stop is kind of like turning day to night as a kind of equivalent, and a lot of people will have a 10-stop in their kit, and the filters can come in brackets that fit on the front of your lens that are either square with a various number of slots, so you can actually build them up on top of each other, and potentially use what are called graduated filters, which have a darker area on the top graduating to a clear area on the bottom. So if your sky is too bright or vice versa. And you can also get equivalent sets. Yeah, Lucky's holding them up right now. So just talk.
Yeah, just got a couple filters here. I may not be able to see the difference in the density here, but in my left hand is a 3-stop filter, and on the right is a 10-stop. So the less stops, the more light it's letting through, or the less dense the filter actually is. And so yeah, that's just an example of the square filters that you might need in one of the larger filter holders for.
Yeah, so you can get different brands that have the holders, and they go into the barrel of your lens, and you just sort of slot them down relative to how many you want to stack up in a row. Sometimes you can fit 3 or more relative to the kind of light you want to allow or block for the shot that you want. I've personally moved to a more run and gun style, which is a screw-on filters. And so basically you just screw it on, and you actually have to have, generally, if you just have single ones, you have the right size for the lens that you're using. And, you know, that's just a standard example of one there. That's probably a 10 stop. And then you can get what are called step-up rings that can actually means you can use that larger lens to fit and screw it onto there and get it onto different size lenses. And Master Lukey, the genius that he is, introduced me to another cool little doogalacki, which I never knew about until Luke got me onto it. And this is called a Revo ring. And this little thing is brilliant because it basically means you can get one circular filter kit at, say, the size of the largest barrel of your lens, which in my case is 82. And I can cinch that onto the front of any lens from 67 to 72 to 77 to 82. So once I put the filter on the back end of this and just screw it in, I can just plonk that instantly onto any lens, and it takes about half a second. So in terms of mucking around or changing lenses or using a different barrel length or moving from a very different lens design, it's really quick, easy, and quite efficient. And they're only about, what, $79, I think, Lukey? And you can get...
I'm not sure. Yeah, I haven't looked lately. So.
Yeah, I just looked this week and it was 79. So if you, like, I bought a NiSi long exposure filter kit after I spoke to Lukey at some length, and they just fit in a little pouch like this. And they have a cool little Velcro strap that actually just ties onto the leg of your tripod. So it's just sitting there the whole time, out of the way, and enough safety from the elements and accessibility for you to just grab them and not have to put everything down or go away from your tripod. So it's very, very simple. But for me, it's just been a bit of a game changer, that because it's just so simple, easy and accessible, I actually use them all the time. And I didn't used to do that at all.
I've been using the there's a newer case or a different case, and it's got a zip on it, so you can actually zip it open, and it's like a little concertina thing in there with all your filters sitting in there. It's my polarizer there and all of that. So they just sort of sit in there and zip it up. Just nice to keep any sand or other bits and pieces out. So
you can stack circular polarizers on top, and I do. But the problem you'll get is you'll start getting vignetting on the sides because the length they are away from the barrel starts extending. And it's all right if you just zoom in a little bit more. You might be at 16, but then I might need to pull it into like 19 or 20 to get rid of the vignetting, or do it in post. That's just one of the small things to look out for.
The thing I don't like, I'll let Nick go. He's keen to say something.
No, I was just going to say, this is one, and there's a lot of this in photography, but this is one area where you buy once, cry once. Listen to this advice. Don't buy cheap eBay filters. You will throw them away within months. Okay. And then you'll buy the expensive filters. Filters are expensive. They are an investment. Some people argue you don't need filters at all. I would argue if you want to be creative, then they're a good thing to have, as we explained tonight. Don't buy cheap crap, no-name brand stuff. Buy stuff that other people are using. We use NiSi. There are definitely a bunch of other brands that are high-end. So look at it. But we certainly like NiSi. And wait until you've got enough money to buy the kit, but then use the smart ways like Paul's talking about, where you only buy one filter, but then you buy step up or step down rings, or one of those fancy Revo rings. So you only have to buy one 10-stop filter, not 6. Like, that's a mistake some people can make if they're getting into photography and go, oh, I need a 10-stop for my 77mm, I need a 10-stop for my 62mm, but you don't. You need one 10-stop that's the biggest one, and then you can buy the step-up rings. Or with the square filters, you can buy. They're only one size, 100 by 100mm usually, for the square filters, and then you buy rings. You then just buy the step-up rings that screw onto the back of your actual filter holder. But yeah, please take the advice, and the same goes for tripods. To be honest, buy once, cry once. Just take a little bit of time and save a little bit more. And yes, they are expensive, but they're worthwhile. Also, look on the second-hand market as well. A lot of people offload filters. They find they don't use them, or they've changed their system or whatever. And you might be able to get a really good brand that's a bit cheaper. So yeah.
Nick, do you want to quantify a little bit as to why, like why the better?
Yep, absolutely. So one of the issues that you have with cheaper filters, and I've had this experience certainly when I was learning, is color shifts. So we talk about neutral density filters, and when we're talking about neutral means neutral color. However, some neutral density filters are not neutral at all. They have a color cast. And if you buy one with a strong color cast, they can be really difficult to deal with in post-production. It is hard to produce a really neutral colored, neutral density filter, particularly the really dark ones. It's not so bad for like a 3-stop one, which isn't quite as dense, but we've got a 10-stop, 15-stop, 20-stop. I mean, it's actually really hard for the company to produce one without any color cast whatsoever. So if you're reading online reviews and people are saying it's got a very weak color cast or not much of a color cast or no color cast, then pay attention to those sort of things, because that probably means it's a good quality filter. And you know, one of the reasons we use the NiSi filters is they generally have a very low color cast or no perceptible color cast. And I've used different brands that have a little bit of a color cast that are easily dealt with. And I've used ones that have really strong ones, and they're a pain in the ass. So just avoid them. And I can guarantee you, if you're spending $30 on a filter and not $130 or more on a filter, then you're going to get one that's got, you know, non-neutral glass. And it can become even more of a problem when you put two filters together. You get these crazy like purples and stuff when you stack two together. And look, the makeup are really good. If you can stack two filters together and still have a pretty neutral color, then you've got good filters. So do your research on that, read about it, see what the brands themselves say, see what the reviews say. Get some advice from photographers that you trust, that have been in a while, that have filters, and they'll point you in the right direction. But yeah, buy once, cry once, for goodness sake. Or you're just throwing your money away for the cheaper things. You think, oh, I might as well just get this because it's cheap. No, it's really a waste of time.
Just to add to that, I remember buying, like when I first, I was probably maybe 14 or 15, so I was in high school and I had very little money to my name, so I was getting the cheap stuff. Yep. And if you get cheap ones, another issue you can run into is like if you get up to a certain aperture, I think you can get like a purple banding in the middle of your filter. Yeah, trying to remove that is an absolute nightmare. So that's another thing to try and avoid as well. And that might be a light leak issue as well. But even just, you know, if you buy a cheap filter system that has light leaks everywhere, then that's going to cause issues as well.
What do you mean by that, Ben? Just for those that don't know what you mean by a light leak.
Yeah, so a light leak. So especially less so when you're doing a screw-on kind of filter, because it's kind of flush with the front of your lens. But especially with 100mm sort of systems, where the kind of the square filters where you're slotting them into a little thing there, if it's got kind of gaps for light to get through past that filter, then you can get
sides.
Through the sides, through the top, wherever it is, then that can start to cause issues with your image. And that can also sometimes happen through the back of your viewfinder if you're using a DSLR still and other things like that. So Luke would and Paul would probably be able to educate on better technique for that, because I don't do too much of this long exposure in the day stuff. But I do know from old experience when I used to do that a bit more, that's something to definitely consider. And I remember seeing people put blue tack over their viewfinder if they were using a DSLR to stop coming in through the viewfinder.
As a Nikon thing. Yeah.
No, it's not a Nikon thing. Nikon have got a shutter curtain.
Okay.
It's got a viewfinder curtain.
It's not a problem with mirrorless anyway, because there's no like prism to worry about that.
But, actually, I suppose, Luke, you wouldn't have had to deal with that in a long time being on Sony for ages.
Not really, no. But I certainly know what you mean about light leak, and even some lenses can light leak, which is quite interesting. And sometimes the only way to really be sure about it is get a big black cloth and put it over. I've had situations where I've had a little pinhole actually in the filter coating itself, and wondering why I was getting these weird light leaks and weird shapes coming through. And there's actually like the tiniest little pinhole through the film coating of the, I guess the neutral density material itself. So that'd sometimes you just have to get a new filter if that's happening, because it's very frustrating, I can assure you. And then one other thing I've seen is I have seen people using variable ND filters for long exposure photography, and I very much I'm not familiar with everything that's on the market, but certainly generally speaking, variable NDs are made more for video applications. They sound very attractive because in one filter you can have a whole bunch of different neutral densities. I suppose you can just spin it and it will change the amount of density that you have, or how dark the filter is. But the problem is that there's not much control over that, and you often get an X pattern where, because it works with two competing polarizers or something. There's some sort of a different films that are interacting that cause the darkness to come through on the filter. And so it's generally not a great approach to use those. As much as it sounds like it's handy to have it all in one filter, it is going to be at the detriment of your image quality. And at the end of the day, if we're putting all this effort in to go to these places, the last thing you want to be doing is putting a really cheap or a piece of glass in front of your maybe very expensive lens, and it's just turning it into mush or really affecting that. So it's a really important consideration. It sort of speaks to what Nick's saying about buy once, cry once. You think about, you might have a $5,000 camera and a $2,000 lens, and then you're putting a $30 piece of crap on the front, and then expecting you might as well have just started off with an entry-level camera or something in some ways. So you just got to really consider that that's the final hurdle in that, and that goes also for cleaning them as well. People that know me know I'm a bit anal about cleaning optics, but it can make a huge difference to the resolution and picture quality if you clean those effectively as well.
Yeah, and arguably the longevity as well. Like a lot of the times you use them often when you're starting out is around seascapes, and you get a lot of salt and film sort of all through them, and it can creep up on you. Quite often you might be shooting and you don't realize that there's a little bit of spray coming through from the ocean, so it slowly starts you wondering why your shots are starting to look a bit milky and a bit silky. And Luke's pretty onto it with maintaining the cleanliness of the glass, and that'll add to the longevity, particularly if you've got polarizers or moving parts that twist around each other. I had a client last week on the workshop who had a very old slot filter system, and literally every time she got the sun at a certain angle, it'll just bounce through in the middle, through the gap, and just bounce through all her photos and just completely blow them out. In fact, I was a bit shocked they even designed a system that had that big an area of exposure to light leaking.
Yeah, and I think another point of keeping it the glass clean is if you're shooting into the sun, you'll see absolutely everything that's on you. You'll get all sorts of crazy patterns and splots and bits and pieces going if you don't have it clean as well. And it's too late by then. You're probably in the golden hour and want to be shooting, not sitting there trying to clean all the muck off your lens. So it's another very good reason as well.
I'd argue one thing to consider is you can push the settings on your camera if you're in a situation where you don't have a filter in order to give yourself the slowest shutter speed possible. And one of the obvious ways to do that is bring your ISO down as low as you can. Like the Canons, you can actually artificially go from 100 down to 50. And I think Nikons go down to like 64, I think.
That's their base ISO, yeah. And
then I might put it on aperture priority and just zip it all the way up to f22 or f32, whatever it is, which is great, which then gives me an idea of the slowest shutter speed I can get at the time. And that's a tricky way to sort of get to a point where you can lean into a long exposure if you don't have a filter with you. So when we're talking about cleaning things, if you have a dirty sensor and you're shooting at f22 into the light, every single spot of everything you can possibly imagine that you didn't even know was inside your camera is going to come up in most of your shots, as I got reminded of this week. So
no.
So Yeah.
And another tip on that too is if you do have to resort to going to f22 because you forgot your filters or don't have any, or it's painful to get them out and you just want to get a quick shot. When you shoot at f22, you get a lot of diffraction, which is a physical property or of lenses that when you're going through such a little pinhole aperture like that. And so what you can actually do is you can take the shot at f22 and get the motion blur and all the smoothness, but then you can take another shot at f8 or f11, which is your sharp aperture, and then just blend in the detail in post as well. So you don't have to you're actually not making a compromise then in terms of the diffraction aspect. That's if you're trying to get it to perfection, I suppose. But f22 can get pretty soft sometimes. So
that same sort of technique applies as well if the land that you're shooting is windy and you've got blowing trees and all that kind of thing. So if you want to get the streaking clouds but also sharp foliage and everything, then shoot your long exposure for water, sky, etc., that you want to be blurry, and then a separate without the ND at a faster shutter speed that'll then freeze trees and all that kind of stuff, and you blend that in. So same sort of concept as the aperture blend there.
30 years of shooting and I never tried it, boys.
Well,
it's blending photographs business. Jeez.
Yeah, I tend to steer away from it too, Paul, but that's
hard work. It is hard work.
It is. And look, and I've seen both Luke and Ben work and seen what they go through to get some of their images. And the end result that they get, and particularly seeing Ben operate fairly recently, there's a lot of work that goes into it, but there's a lot of thought that goes into it to get the images that you need to then get the end result that Ben's getting particularly. And it might be worth getting you to show some of your images now.
Yeah, absolutely.
While we're talking about you.
Yeah, we're probably going to have to just based on timing, probably got about 10 minutes each, and then because we want to show a few shots at the end and talk about the comp still.
All right. Let me get up my Adobe Photoshop.
Share screen when you're ready.
Yeah. I'll just I need to quit and reopen Zoom because I haven't allowed the system preferences to share my screen yet.
Well, what we can do is just switch over to Paul then. Are you ready to go, Paul?
And then, ready to roll.
Yeah.
Born ready.
Cool.
Yeah. All right.
I'll join back in a sec.
Yeah, no dramas.
How's it looking, guys?
Yep.
It's looking great.
I remember that shot.
Yeah, this was a believe in yourself shot. I remember I sent it to New Zealand and I got a 78 and I just about cried. And I thought it was one of the best images I've ever shot in my life in terms of symbolism and meaning and metaphor. And then I almost gave up and I said, stuff, I took it to APA and it got 98.
Whoa.
I hadn't touched it, same lens. So another one, a different conversation about believing in yourself and the work that you're doing and doing it because you love it and the power and the storytelling in there. It's actually shot just down the road from my house of a big light sculpture during dark mofo. It was about 0 degrees, and I think when I picked up my tripod, it got stuck onto it because it was so cold.
I was just interested because that cross is red, isn't it? Normally, was there a temptation to leave a bit of color in there?
Didn't like the casting or the coloration around it. The work between the three different elements of the trees, which are blended through here, the lights are a different color, and that was a different color again. And they just felt a bit garish, and they didn't have the fluidity and the grace for the storytelling or the spirituality they want to imbue in the shot. I call this ascension. That's actually the cenotaph in honor of those given their lives for the war. And it feels like in honor of those souls rising to heaven is what I feel I read into that image. And that wouldn't exist about a long exposure. And there's no way I could have shot that with the kind of light that was around at the time without a longer exposure and a pretty wide lens and some hand warmers would have been great. This is quite an old one, but it's not super obvious what it is, but it's actually the full moon dancing along the water. Sitting at the edge of Maria Island looking north to Freycinet, and it's about a half a minute exposure. So very simple. And in some ways, long exposure images can really help you simplify your images and imbue them with a sense of grace and fluidity and flow that doesn't exist with static images or fast shutter speeds, which lean more heavily into sort of textural elements. I guess this is just one I took This is about a 3 or 4 minute exposure just back at home
Wow.
in January. And that's actually a gannet colony down below who are running and moving around. I didn't mind sort of having some movement in them, as well as some sort of long fluid kind of, moody kind of. It was a really moody, stormy kind of afternoon, and I wanted to sort of lean into that a little bit. But
It's
still,
amazing how they stay still sometimes. I mean, I've had seagulls that have stayed still for like 10 seconds.
I did
Not moving at all.
a whole lot of this colony, and I was really surprised about that. That's again what Nick was alluding to, leading into that sense of movement, and you can see this. It's long enough now that the stars are actually moving again, which is not necessarily what you want. But I was more interested in getting this, like the diagonal shape of these rock structures here, kind of mirroring the movement lines of the clouds, which I thought led to something pretty interesting. A couple of more traditional ones, just not Sirui stock standard, but the kind of moody sort of movement based sort of work that I'd lean into on most sort of shoots. So I was actually standing there about 8 days ago, actually, and it was pretty beautiful. One of my favorite places down at Broody. That's sort of
such great work there.
it's sort of Broody's my home away from home, as Lucky well knows. Been going there for 24 years, and this changes every time I'm there. So I almost just gravitate there.
Like your background too.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the background's from the same place. Yeah, well said, Lucky. Here's an example of timing. So it's not too short and not too long, because I really wanted to get that filament of movement and that dynamism of the power of the waves, which can be lost when you go for too long an exposure. And as if you play a lot with large waves and movements, I generally find personally, and you guys can argue either way, that when the waves are falling away or dropping away, I tend to find that's where the sweet spot is for the style and the aesthetic of movement that comes through.
So dramatic, that one. I love it. It's really the light, especially, and the texture in those rocks just works so well.
And I was standing there 5 days ago.
That rock in the foreground is 10 meters high.
Wow.
That's a big rock.
It's pretty solid and ancient and beautiful. And we haven't really talked about the more traditional waterfall stuff, but it's there. Lukey reminded me a few times that having a polarizer is actually a pretty good idea. It reduces the reflections. It lets you look a little bit deeper into the flow of the water. And obviously, and often that's might be all you need to have with you, because you don't often need more than half a second or 1 second to get the kind of flow, and you can often do it a lot shorter than that. I know, Lukey, you often go a bit shorter, don't you?
I'm a big fan of a quarter of a second with these sort of things. It just gives you that looks like that shutter speed would be similar to that around that sort of mark, I would have thought. You get that bit of texture in the actual water.
I think you were standing next to me, Lukey. This is one of our workshops in February up north, and I was just doing the traditional 1 or 2 seconds, and Lukey's like, I just do a quarter, and I was like, huh. And you can see the filaments of water, and they're kind of you can really get that separation a little bit more when you have a slower shutter speed. So I've been doing it for years at about a second, and I'm actually was really excited when Luke mentioned that, and I slowed it down and done that quite a lot since. And also the polarizer really helped lean in and get behind, so it wasn't just a blanket thrown off on top of the rocks. It was almost like a filaments sort of running.
I think that there's often I hear feedback too from, I guess, non-photographers, and they see a really silky waterfall, and I think they never see it like that personally, and so that it sort of doesn't work for them sometimes, and so it might be even a bit more approachable having a shorter shutter speed as well. Even
so, this isn't a favorite photograph, but it was about the conversation we had earlier with Luke and Ben, which is why I quickly chucked it in. So that's an example where the movement of the grass tells you how damn windy it was. And that's actually kind of the point in some ways of this image, that including all this semi-blurred foreground, which really, like, how do you photograph the wind? And this is an example of, wow, the presence of it is really, really strongly woven into this image. Even though you can look at it as a distraction, it has a lot of presence, and there's no doubt in your mind that it's a big part of what's sculpting this landscape and very present in this particular moment. So I was rushing around trying to get ICM, and I just got one random shot, and no, it's not my favorite, but this was a mixture of long exposure and ICM at the same time, quite late. And it just creates a different conversation with the subject. It becomes a little bit more painterly potentially, or a little bit metaphorical, or a little bit about alliterative of sound, or a movement, or something that's beyond the obvious. And and that was just something I was just sitting there thinking, oh, why don't I just play around for a little bit while I'm waiting for the stars to come out.
Is that when we were getting those volcanic ash sunsets?
It was actually. That was the same shoot. Like I've got other ones that with the richness comes through.
Oh, I hope that comes back at some point. That was just so nice, unbelievable.
So this is a little bit about happy accidents and abstracts. I've got a couple of images a little more abstract in terms of both the technique and how they're presented. That's a straight in camera shot. I think it's even raw. I just cropped it, and that was on a King Island workshop with the master of King Island, Ian Rolfe.
Sorry, Paul. Before you move on, that last one, I've got someone in my inspirations kind of thing section that we're going to do, whose pretty much entire body of work is that style of photography. So. It's really cool that you showed that one. Do you remember what sort of shutter speed or movement or anything that you did with that one?
Well, I'd have to open it up and look out. I'm trying to be quick, so you got time, Ben.
That's all good. All good.
2.5 seconds for that one.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Do you have a go-to shutter speed for ICM, Paul? Just out of interest, it's like a starting point.
Oh, it depends on the breadth and the expanse that I'm trying to cover in the scene at the one time. If I'm trying to cover a whole skyscape, it also depends on the focal length that I'm using, whether it's wide or quite zoomed in. So it's probably a little bit of a tricky question to say as a starting point, but
that's all right. I just thought
maybe 2 seconds to 4 or 5, and it depends also if I'm doing it by hand or if I've got a panning head.
Because it's interesting because I would almost go to a quarter or like a much shorter shutter speed too. I guess it depends on how fast you're actually moving everything around too.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that will lead into that. And you're right, like some of them will really suit just a short one. And it depends if you're zooming in and out or... So, does anyone recognise what this is?
Is it...
It's a straight shot.
It's too blurry, Paul.
Is it water over a rock?
So it's the river flow around a rock. You can see a little bit of seagrasses up here on the left. A little bit of the river grasses just wobbling into the scene and just to swirl around. And I played around to get the right shutter speed to keep the dynamism, and it just turned it into the central kind of eye. And it was just a really normal kind of scene. And I thought, well, how can I bring some of myself into this picture that is speaking about a little bit more about me as an artist and what I see and what I feel more than what I'm seeing. And I think long exposure techniques can really open up a lot of conversations like that. So these are a quick series of portraits because people don't necessarily generally associate portraits with long exposures. This is a very kind of obvious maybe one to start with. It's only half a second and I'm like telling my friend there to stay still. But you can get that point of the start of that conversation. This is probably a longer exposure. So I got my subject to lie down, so I wasn't necessarily needing to be concerned about any sort of movement. And I like the waves of the hair and the waves of the water kind of alluding to each other, and the diagonals that are running down in parallel with the shape of the water. It's got some nice features about it. This image. Here, this was sorry about the zooming. I just got this off my phone, but this was a long exposure conversation about an artist doing a beautiful performance in the art for Takaina, and there's color versions of this who are a little bit more dynamic. But this at least just speaks to how even just quite a short shutter speed. This is probably only a quarter of a second or something, because there's a lot of movement going on with the fire poise that it added a lot of shape and dynamism that wouldn't have been there without that longer exposure. And this was a dancer, and I actually, shot a dancer in situation on a tripod, with longer exposure, just to get that sense of movement and energy and dynamism into her performance. That was quite difficult to do as a static kind of single shot, actually, but it lent into it really well. And you'll find it, it's a very fine line, because their movements might go slower and faster, and you don't really have time to adjust your shutter speed in time. So it's a bit of experimenting, but it can be a lot of fun. It doesn't look like a long exposure, but that's a fairly long one of an Aboriginal artist down at the Remarkable Caves incredible man, Will Stackhouse, and he actually did a watercolor painting of this because he loved the image so much and sent it to me. And this actually shot on a King Island workshop with Lukey.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
I was
cool.
kind of like, it was the middle of the day. It was kind of like not the obvious thing to try and take a portrait of someone with a long exposure with movement, but I just timed it and got a little bit lucky that he kept still enough with the inflow and outflow of a wave, and it just adds a more of a storytelling feel to it that wouldn't have been there without it, I don't think. This was a self-portrait that I was actually doing for an assignment. It wasn't my brief, but that was actually like, how do you do an astro self-portrait? And I was playing around with that, and there was a nautical narrative to that green light as well, which was part of the conversation. And I was using I was setting up my camera to do a like wireless release, so I could walk down the end and get the focus right and shoot myself, which was trickier than it looks.
Got a pair of satellites up there as well. Yeah.
And that's like, I actually shot that at 1.4 actually on an 85 mil, which is why the background's a bit blurry. So here, we haven't really talked much about light painting, but that's another fantastic sort of thing you can play around with long exposure. So here I've got, a good exposure for a galaxy core, and I'm actually using two different lights because the broader, softer light I'm using for the foreground would reach the background. So in the same exposure, I do that first, and then I get a longer beam torch to zoom down on the background here to then start pulling in some of the features in the back. So this, I haven't really done anything to this image, so it's not perfect in terms of how, that's probably a bit hot for me, blah, blah, blah. But I just wanted to talk about that idea and play. And here I gave myself a little bit longer, and I used 2 or 3 different torches. That's actually, if you zoom in, you can see the stars and planets all behind it. And here I am. I was sitting under this tree for 2 days. I was on a 4-day silent solo retreat, actually, out in deep in the Tarpine, and I just had such a strong relationship with this tree that I just literally got up at 2 a.m. and said, I'm just gonna dance with you and have a bit of a play and come up with a visual conversation, playing with lights, which I hadn't really done before. So it was a good experiment. But it's quite difficult to light up things in the foreground and the background equally with the one singular lighting source. You've got to be a bit clever.
Need a lot of refining required, isn't there, to get it right? And the white balances and
the white balance between the lights as well is quite significant, as Lucky was right onto it. So this was a commercial project where I was actually doing a long exposure, and it was I was the head photographer for Wanderlust Australasia for 3.5 years, going around doing their retreats, and I thought, how can I get some of their branding? And I was actually using a performance artist who was doing hula hoops with LED lights, and we played around for a little while to get the branding for Wanderlust out in the forest, which was really fun as a long exposure. And I had to play around until we got the beginning and ending sort of nailed pretty well to keep the refinement of the letter. Again, just thinking of ideas. So another thing a long exposures can allow you to do is playing around with fireworks. And I didn't go up there to shoot fireworks. I was sitting, this is my home. This is where I was born and raised. And
the cracker of a beach. I've been there before.
This is Lion Rock here. And I can tell you a million stories and times I've almost died and whatever else. And girls I'd fallen in love with or whatever you want from this beach. That's my home turf. But some random person started letting off fireworks while I was up there shooting sunset. And I kind of liked it. This was actually, I think it was the day after New Year's Eve. You must have a few leftovers and just wanted to play. But that's another realm you can lean into with long exposures a little bit more. I just threw in a few daylight ones, like often people don't think of during the day. This is another one with Lukey on the King Island workshop. It's like a straight sunny day where you probably wouldn't even think about taking a photograph. And I just wanted to throw that in to get you sort of maybe thinking outside, well, maybe I won't just give up it when it's, 1 o'clock in the afternoon and sunny.
Oh, no, daytime's awesome.
I'm going to get my filters out and I'm going to play. So I find it actually broadens the amount of time that I shoot, and I do a lot more shooting during the day with less ideal lighting conditions because of the capacity of it. That was on a trip with Lukey up to Flinders. This is normally a place I shoot this time of day because the light wasn't there, but by playing with a longer exposure, it adds this serenity and this peace and calm to the scene that wouldn't have been there otherwise, which I quite like. This was my first time where I was actually had no filters at all. And I was trying to do long exposures by hand with my new R5, which had all the inbuilt stabilization. So that's actually handheld. And it was my first time where I was like, well, how good can this camera go? And I think that was not far off a second from memory. But my point is, with technology changing, there's there's other opportunities now that weren't there before to do a lot more things by hand. One of my favorite spots, I got 2 back to back, and I think I'm going to finish on these so Ben can have a crack. And the idea here is, we had this conversation earlier, this is a longer exposure, and you can see how the refinement of the aurora itself is getting a bit murky. And the same night, with a different lens at a much, much shorter exposure, all of a sudden the separation in the features has become very, very significant. And it's actually literally, they were shot within a minute or two of each other. So that's a good example of the different choices, partly by the lens. That was at 85 1.4, and I shot at 1.4, and that was a 16 mil at 2.8. So
any guesses on shutter speeds there, Paul?
I'll have to go out and look up there. Let's see. So that's 8, that's 6. So it's a little bit less than I thought, actually, but it's partly because of the breadth of the lens. But when you're zooming in really tight on an 85 in particular, you really do need to have a faster shutter speed, because there's more relative movement for you relative to the thing. And I'll just finish on one last image. And that was that was a timing thing, and I was waiting for that to move to the edge of the frame to give me that diagonal flow and mirror that, and it was a bit of a fluke this night that there was some bio out there as well. Tiny little offset diagonal there, and a Magellan cloud there, and anyway, that's a whole other conversation, night photography, which we'll get into later. But
I guess all night photography, I guess, inherently is a long exposure. But I guess for the purposes of what we're trying to discuss here, it's more about the creative aspects of long exposures and where you'd use them and how long and those kind of things. So,
and I just wanted to throw in something that you might not have thought of before, particularly in the portraiture.
Oh, absolutely, that was cool.
Cool. All right, I'll share my screen, and I've got host disabled, participant screen share.
Oh yeah, because you just jumped in there. Just 1 second. All right,
cool.
There you go.
All right, let me get it up on Bridge. Is what I was going to show on. Okay, so you can kind of see how increasingly green my portfolio is getting in terms of proportions of what I'm shooting these days. So yeah, like I was saying before, I don't do as much of this really deliberate long exposure 10 stop, 15 stop ND as Paul and Luke and Nick do as well. For the most part, I'm shooting in that under a second sort of space, a quarter, half a second, whatever it is, to retain sort of texture in the flowing water or whatever it is. And I really like, sharp textures in clouds and stuff, which is just my personal taste for how I shoot. But, experimenting with movement is something I want to get into a lot more, actually. So this is providing me with some good inspiration. So a lot of the time when I'm getting beyond 1 second, it's more out of necessity rather than a creative decision. So this was a rainforest shot that I shot in my Blue Mountains workshop close to a year ago now. And it was pretty dim, sort of rainforest in there. It was a beautiful spot. I came across this area on total accident with my participants, and this stream kind of funneled down. And so you can see by the fact that this water is rather smooth that I think it probably was going for about 3 seconds exposure for that one. And I've got a little bit of motion in this fern over here, which is something I forgot to consider, which was taking a higher ISO exposure with a faster shutter speed to freeze the motion and blending it in. So I forgot to do that time, which is something I'd usually do for the sake of image quality. Sort
of one of those things where if it was more sharp on the edge, it might be less useful in that sense, like it being soft on the edge might actually be like make you draw your eye to the sharper part, which is in the middle. Yeah. That's another thing too, for sure. Here's one that it's not like a popular one of mine, but I've got a weird connection with it, and I really liked just kind of choosing a shutter speed and a particular timing of the wave that really just made this photo all about just pure texture. And I really liked the layering of clouds up the top and the kind of streaking in the waves down there. And I played around, I think, a little bit with texture slider and stuff in my editing to really kind of just make the entire image a rather similar sort of type of texture, and just like this blue kind of wash with the ocean. So yeah, I had a lot of fun shooting that one morning.
when it was went to go out for a sunrise, was completely lackluster, but the cool kind of silvery blue tones provided something really fun to play with on my 100 to 400. Now this is 1/3 of a second, and it's actually handheld. This is one of I don't do handheld much. I tend to only do it when I'm in a tight squeeze for time. And I was on a deadline shooting some tutorial video with Luke. Luke was here for this.
That's right.
I was there too, mate.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Actually, Paul was there too. Hey, totally forgot about that. It was a beautiful day and one of my favorite spots. And so, I had to keep moving. And I sat down here without the tripod to kind of take test exposures, but then kind of realized if I really, lent into myself and tucked the elbows in and stuff. And if I stopped up to F16 and focused around on this trunk, then I got everything in focus. And so if I just fired off about 4 in a row at 1/3 of a second, and 1 or 2 of those were sharp enough all throughout to be usable. And I really like, as I was saying, the kind of texture that retains in the water rather than totally smoothing it out.
If it wasn't like a shutter speed around that sort of point, the amount of texture in the water would just sort of become very distracting. I would have thought it has a really a very pleasant sort of calm feeling when the water is sort of flowing.
Exactly. Any faster, it would have started to freeze it too much, and it would be just too much texture everywhere. I think if I was in the tripod, I probably would have maybe gone for half a second for a little bit softer. But I think for what I could manage at the time, 1/3 was perfect.
So obviously, a good tip for everyone's just to take a whole bunch of different exposures, and then you can think about it later.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, good point.
This is the shot that Nick was mentioning earlier. Actually. That canyon. This was beautiful area, and quite a tricky spot to set up, because I think from memory I had one of the legs of my tripod sitting on a floating log, which is I'm glad I was there. Otherwise I would have struggled to get this position. So I think I was probably about 1 second for the shutter speed of the water here. So you can see that there's a bit of texture, but like in kind of little pinpoints of detail in here. But the fact that it's sort of starting to homogenize indicates, it's starting to get a little bit into that 1 second sort of territory. And, with canyons being quite dark, you do need to extend your shutter speed a little bit. And, using a polarizer, because there's so much just wet, glary reflections, that means you also need to compensate for that too.
The dynamic range is just awful depending on the time of day and what weather you have. But it
was totally overcast, but I still had to exposure blend for that bright bit up the top middle. And looking back at this shot, so we were in a bit of a rush. I had somewhere to get to, so I didn't have heaps of time to really play around with this shot. What I would have liked is actually to do a longer exposure. So I think I was shooting at about ISO 400, so I wasn't having to really put my exposure up too much, because I still wanted to get some of that texture. But looking back at it, I think I should have lent into a longer exposure, because I would have loved for these bubbles out here and foam trail and swirl. Exactly. So that's a artistic decision that actually Tim Raitt did that in his one. And I saw that and was like, oh yeah, that's a duh, it would have been a perfect time to do that. So that's an artistic choice that I missed out on, and have kind of looked back in hindsight being like, that's something to keep in mind next time. So
it's all part of the learning journey, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Has Tim posted his photo of that, has he?
He shared it in the Discord that I help run. I don't know if he posted it on Instagram. Not sure.
He might throw everyone off now that he's shooting so many aerials, and they'll be like, what's going on with this canyon stuff all of a sudden?
Yeah, he was saying it was his first like ground-based landscape work in years. So he said he had a great time. It was it was a great day.
Exciting to hear.
He's just messaging me about 20 minutes ago, and he's frothing about an aerial trip in 3 weeks. I might be going with him, so he's still on it.
Yeah. Something we've sort of touched on as well is using long exposures and movement to create impressionism, like that one that Paul shared before that I commented on, and something that I've started to move into and have a lot of fun with. You just kind of have to take a lot of duds to get one that ends up working. But this was one where I think I just stopped up to a high aperture and went as low as I could ISO wise, because sharpness didn't matter in this case. I didn't need a sharp photo because the intention of it is to be blurry. So diffraction wasn't an issue for me. And I zoomed in as I twisted the camera, which created this kind of vortex effect on this tree with autumn colors on it, which is, created this really abstract sort of effect with the kind of high key baby blue and golden sort of colors. So it can be a lot of fun with texture and color and impressionism. And on that same vein, this is another one that I released in a rainforest gallery that I captured this one with Nick, actually, May last year, in a pretty special spot. I think I was in a section of forest where I was struggling to find anything with a wide angle. And so I just put on my mid-range lens and slowed down the shutter speed to probably, 1/10 or 1/8 or something like that. And just started taking repeated shots with varying movement, not having any method to the madness, and just seeing what results it could get. And I really latched onto this one because of that tiny patch of sharpness in the middle. And then the rest of it's just got this swirling kind of fever dream sort of texture and movement to it. That impressionism, and if you deliberately want to create a sense of chaos or overwhelmment or whatever it is, I don't think overwhelmment is a word, but we'll run with it.
Overwhelm, yeah. But I think it's obviously a great thing to do if you're kind of struggling to find a composition, which can happen in a forest like that, where there is that chaos, and it's a nice way to not be, maybe release some frustration and actually make something that's a bit different.
And I mean, like you mentioned,
I just had a random statement come into my head. If in doubt, swing it about.
That's how Paul lives his life.
Oh, dude.
New life philosophy.
You want to know where you went wrong, Paul? Re-examine that statement.
My point is just that. Like, often you can get stuck and you're like, what the hell do I do here? And it can be really amazing where you can get from a creative point of view.
You don't want to have to get another panel member now, Paul, so just be careful with that.
And like, as you mentioned, Luke, like rainforests are quite a chaotic environment. So doing this kind of thing can actually convey that sense of chaos, I suppose, in an artistic way. So it can be an artistic choice to kind of, talk about the nature of a place. And my kind of another one in that same vein, this was actually double exposure, combining sharp, like a non-movement with like a zoom movement. So you can see that there's a sharp texture here bleeding through with the kind of zoom texture, long exposure of the exact same framing, which kind of gives that great. I wasn't particularly compelled by just the sharp version on its own or just the moving version on its own, but combining them, created something pretty special, I found. Here's another one, kind of getting into that sort of 1/3 of a second shutter speed, and as you can see, it just retains such nice texture in that water. You get like enough for it to turn into streaks, but not so much that it just becomes milky. It's just kind of my sweet spot that I really love to shoot a lot of work in. And obviously it depends on what speed the water's moving at. So if the water's kind of really meandering along, then you need to go a little bit longer. If it's really rushing past you, then you can go to 1/5 or 1/6 or something and get the same effect. But typically around the 1/3 is a really sweet spot for a nice kind of balance between those two. This was that Astro shoot with Dan Tran and Ben Chubb that I mentioned earlier, and my first foray into Astro in a long time. I think so. For the land, I kind of delved into median stacking because I was having to shoot at ISO 10,000 for this kind of scene. So I think I median stacked about 6 or 7 photos at around the 60-second mark to reduce noise. And then I also brought that into Topaz denoise to help clear that out. And the sky, I actually captured this composition at 17 mil, which is just how I liked the framing, which meant I had to shoot, I think I was at about 20 or 15 seconds and ISO 10,000 for that. And I still got a tiny bit of streaking on this side. So, so you kind of, shorter exposure for the sky to keep the stars nice and sharp, and then longer exposures for the land to get that detail through, like what Luke was showing in his Lake Oberon shot right at the start. Now thought I'd show some of my wedding work actually. I actually like to play around with a bit of long exposure in, my weddings, like what Paul does with his portraits. And you've probably seen dance party photos before where the lights are streaky and stuff. So this is a technique where I'm shooting at about half a second and I'm using a pretty strong flash, about 1/8 strength on a speed light on my camera, and a little grid to kind of narrow the range of where the flash is hitting. So it's really just hitting my central subjects, and then so it freezes them in this nice little intimate moment, and then blurs everything else, and just kind of gets into this. It's getting towards the end of the night. People have had a few drinks. It kind of leans into that impression that people might have of those moments. So it's a really cool, creative sort of way of depicting that sort of environment. Here's another one, except this one was just handheld, no flash. I think I was probably about 1/3 of a second or so, just to get the movement in these people here. No tripod, because it was more about an impressionistic sort of effect rather than being technically perfectly sharp. So you can see there's kind of ghosting up here. But yeah, it's just a really cool way of showing movement in people as well as the landscape. If you dabble with portraiture and events and all that kind of thing, especially if you're delivering a shoot of an event or a wedding or whatever it is, and you're scrolling through a few hundred photos that are all tack sharp, sometimes delivering a few that are deliberately artistically blurry can really help break that up and stand out. Getting back to the landscapes, this is one of the only ND filter photos that I've actually created in the last few years. This was kind of mid-afternoon at Bermuda. Obviously Camel Rock, a lot of people know of this spot. It's a pretty iconic seascape location in Australia. And I've always felt that it really lends itself to that dramatic, stormy sort of sky. And this kind of mid-afternoon pale light lent itself really well to that. But naturally, to get to that sort of 1/3 of a second speed, I needed to then add on an ND3 and my polarizer to get to that speed. And obviously that meant I could get these nice streaks of foam cutting through here, and the polarizer reduced the reflections so that there was nice separation between the water underneath and those white streaks. And I did a little bit of blending of like a time blend to get maximum wave action in this mid-ground out here. But yeah. So as you can see, that kind of 1/3, similar here, 1/3 of half a second, whatever it is, the blurring but not total milkiness.
I think it's a pretty good thought process that you don't have to do a very long exposure to get sometimes less is more when it comes to that.
Yeah. Now this one. Yeah, this one, I've actually got the person who inspired this one up in my kind of for the next section. But the lake was already very, very still for this photo, but you get occasional little ripples. So this was, I can't remember how long this one was, but I stopped down pretty heavily, I think probably to F18 or F20 to get it in focus. And yeah, it just got nice and smooth, really minimalistic sort of shot. So for minimalism, it's those extra long exposures are a great technique. Again, you can see this is around that 1/3 of a second exposure. I think it might have even been 1/4 of a second. But because this wave was moving past me so much faster, you can see that this actually looks a lot smoother than previous ones of mine that I've shown here. And that's just purely because of the velocity of that water, and that will give you different effects even if you're shooting at the same shutter speed. So yeah, something to consider as well. And this one was heading into blue hour. I think this was probably 1.5 seconds for that streaking foreground coming in there. Luke was here with me for this one. We got the Aurora.
Could shoot that one.
Yeah, Aurora and bioluminescence.
The episode, the thumbnail from the episodes from the same night.
Maybe 90 minutes or so after this.
Still missing the invite I didn't get for that one, boys.
I think that was just a quick. I think we were like
you changed
our plans were flip flopping by the hour. I think.
I think we decided we'd be there at like when I landed that day. We changed our plans because the Tarkine was going to be socked in. We decided like by lunchtime we were going to go to Lion Rock and hiked in from there. Like it was very last minute.
And it was in October, so it wasn't necessarily a lot of daylight to play with. So had to do it. And it paid off very handsomely. Is that we might have to leave it there with yours, Ben, because we're going to start to. Oh, there it is there.
Final one. There we go.
We got to speak about this.
That's all for me.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and this one here, what's really special about it is the what you've done with the foreground in terms of the long exposure. Having been there myself, and one of my regrets from shooting that night was that I was more moving around like a headless chook, trying to get a whole bunch of stuff rather than sitting in one spot and really working with something like you've done here and getting a really nice clean foreground exposure, which is really what makes this. A lot of other things make it too, but certainly having a nice clean foreground like that, that's really, the milky kind of really soft silky water reflecting all of the colors, really highlighting the little sort of grooves in the rock there. It just all works so well together. And obviously it's the infamous trifecta unicorn scenario with the Bio, Aurora, and Milky Way on top of that, which you won't see too many shots with the combo like that.
Yeah.
So the exposure blending here, Ben?
Yeah, so I think it was about 3 or so minutes for the foreground there. And I think I actually shot that one at f4 too to get more of that foreground in focus, because I didn't want to focus stack that. So I think it was f4 and around 3 or 4 minutes, just to get enough detail there. And I brought that up a fair bit in processing and noise reduction techniques and all that kind of stuff, just to bring out detail and color and everything. So there's a fair bit of processing work just to get it up to scratch, because there's grainy, dark, noisy sort of files to work with. But yeah, it turned out really well. And then the sky, I believe, was 25 seconds, which was a little bit too long. I think I have got a bit of streaking over in this side and the stars. There's some patches where they're nice dots, but I think this side suffers a little bit more from some streaking in the stars. And that's just more because I was a bit of an astrophotography novice at the time.
I tried my best to help you out, but no,
you failed. Terrible.
I'd love to see a tutorial of how you put this together and post for all the various. I think that would be very popular.
Would be a good one, definitely.
Yeah, this one may be a bit too long, but I have been considering, because I only just did this one recently. I have been considering doing this one because it's using some more updated techniques of mine.
Cool. That's fantastic, and a really nice breadth of different locations and styles, and even some people stuff and that kind of thing. We're actually already over time, so I feel like we could still show some of the sort of inspiring photographers that we're talking about, but we'd like only be able to talk about them for about a minute each or so.
Maybe you could do them when you have the competition announcement in a month.
That could be another option, just so that we can let everyone still have a bit of an evening. I think that's probably what we'll do, because that we'll lose at least another half an hour doing that, and that's the way it goes. I think the main thing is that we are having this competition for long exposures. So if you have any photographs that are what was our cutoff? 10 seconds, wasn't it? 10 seconds or longer.
Was it? I thought it was a quarter of a second.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Yes, it was. It was a quarter of a second. It's been a while. Quarter of a second or longer taken from the start of the year, so January the 1st up until now. But then also you've got all of the time until we have the episode in a month's time or so. We'll provide some links and some emails, and if you're on our mailing list, please join it. We'll also put the link to the competition in the description as well of the episode, just so you can find out a little bit more information about where to submit your entries, and some details around that as well. But just keep an eye out for that. And feel free to contribute or submit an image to the competition, and for your chance to win a $250 NiSi or Sirui voucher. So
what are we looking for? We're looking for something that demonstrates the long exposure, not necessarily just because it's a long exposure entered. It's more that demonstrates an effect from the long exposure.
Definitely. I mean, I think what we've been able to cover off tonight is the fact that long exposure, there's a reason why we do long exposures. There's always some kind of sometimes it's out of necessity, sometimes because we're trying to simplify the scene, or we're trying to show movement, like what Paul was trying to show wind in the grasses, or I like to go longer so that it smooths things out and makes it look calm. So I guess we're trying to see examples of images that really are showing that the photographer has a great concept or handle on using long exposures to their advantage in those images. And so for that reason,
deliberate creative decision making.
Exactly. And for that reason, astrophotography may not rate as well, because that's sort of out of necessity in a way. You're doing a long exposure because you need to, because it's at night time. So but if you had a night shot where there was cloud streaking or things like that, it's a little bit different. But if it's a straight sort of vanilla astro shot, in that regard, just for the purposes of a competition, we're trying to encourage more so daytime and cloud movement, or water movement, or other aspects. So hopefully that's not too ambiguous. But
so I think if you want to win the prize, like for me, being a judge, what would rise to the top for me is that it's not technique for the sake of technique, that there's a reason and something that it really brings into the conversation, the image, that adds or takes it to another level by using that technique. So when you're looking at a scene and trying to decide whether that's the kind of way you want to approach it, be quite thoughtful and deliberate about where and how and that technique can accentuate or lift or take it beyond into another kind of level of metaphor or feeling or ambience that really supports what you're trying to say as a photographer. So I think long exposure and those creative decisions, as Ben said really beautifully, it really speaks to you and the way you see and the way you feel and the way you interpret what's around you. And that's the beauty of long exposure, that it opens up so much more widely the different ways that you can imbue that into an image.
Fantastic. Yes. So well, I think that's probably wrapped everything up. Don't forget about the NiSi and Sirui sales. So if you're inspired to go out and get some filters or tripods based on going out there and getting your long exposures for the competition, perhaps, then keep that in mind too.
Don't forget, there's a sale on Literally that started today.
Yeah, that's right. So
have a good look on the NiSi site.
NiSi website and Sirui websites, and you'll be able to get a discount on there. So all right, well, Ben, thanks again for joining the team and being part of it and showing your beautiful shots and great insights, and it's just can't wait to see where we can go and maybe even talk about canyons or something like that. Already came to mind, so there's plenty to talk about. So anyone want to wrap it up?
Well, I'd like Nick to actually. This is kind of the last official night for Nick to be on the panel. I'm certainly looking forward to having him on again, but in terms of being a regular feature, he's come back to his busy life and a happier wife probably from not taking him away from the family all the time, as we've been doing for 3 years. And I really wanted to acknowledge Nick for that level of commitment. None of us signed up for 3 years of this. It was So Nick is a very busy man, and he's a family man, and he has a job that requires a huge amount from him. So to put that much level of time and commitment into the show has been pretty exceptional, my friend.
Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate that. I've really enjoyed doing this, and I've met a lot of people that I wouldn't have otherwise have spoken to through this show, and that and all those introductions have really come through you, Paul, and Luke as well. People that I just have heard of, but I didn't know or didn't have that connection to. And so, from a personal point of view, it's brought a lot of people to me that I just wouldn't have otherwise met. And so, it's very, very valuable. And the decision to sort of step away from the show is not one I've taken too lightly, but. I think it's a good time now. We've got Ben Long, who is going to do a pretty reasonable job of replacing me, I think. So That's fantastic, and it's great to have him here. And I'm not gone forever. And there's a big back catalogue. You can see my face if you need to watch me.
We might have to have a stand-in sign or something.
Yeah, look, there's been a bit of reflection for me in the last 4 or 5, 6 months. So I haven't done a lot of photography as well, and I need to sort of have a bit of a break to then reinvent my love for it. I haven't lost it, but I just, things have just been a bit awkward for me in certain spaces, and so I'm just and photography has suffered as a result. And I'd really like to get that love back, which I will. But I just need a bit of time, and I'm feeling I'm not. This is probably not correct, but I'm just sort of feeling I'm not bringing as much to the show that I have in the past, and so it was the idea just to step away and get on with doing some other things and getting my love back for it. But
definitely gives you a chance to work on your NFT portfolio.
There'll be no NFT portfolio. I don't plan on looking at AI and how it can financially assist me in the future or anything like that. But I mean, that is one of the other things. I'm not a full-time photographer, although with my job I do it every day, but I'm not a full-time creative photographer as such. And so there are different motivations for me to be doing this show. I think slightly different than Paul and Luke, and Ben, of course, is a full-time photographer as well. So it'll bring a bit more professionalism to the show. Not saying I wasn't professional, but just the aspect that all three are working photographers. I'll put my 2 cents worth in every now and again, come back, and particularly stuff to do with Tasmania. My love for photography is intrinsically linked with where I live. I don't know that I would have the same love if I was somewhere else. I really don't. But it is intrinsically linked to where I live, and it's a response to what I see and feel. And it's become more and more that over the years. And the more and more I do it, the less and less I want to even think about doing photography somewhere else. I'm not saying I wouldn't, but it's really, to me, it's about Tasmania and the wild place here. So, yeah, on that note, I think we'll say goodnight, and thanks everyone for watching, and see you when I get into the next show sometime in the future.
Thanks very much. And thanks all. Have a great evening, and we'll see you again in a fortnight's time. Keep an eye on the emails for more details on the competition. And we'll see